On the morning of the 2nd February 1943, General der Infanterie Karl Strecker composed a final radio message from his command post in Stalingrad's destroyed northern industrial district. His 11th Corps had held 2 days past the capitulation of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, 48 hours that Berlin would describe as symbolic resistance, but that Strecker, in his transmissions, framed in operational terms. Time for the German line further west to consolidate. Then he signed the surrender document. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. At least, that is what the history books tell us. The official count of Axis prisoners taken in and around Stalingrad runs to roughly 91,000 men. Of those, approximately 5,000 ever returned to Germany. The remainder died in the transit marches, the labour columns, and the camp conditions documented in NKVD administrative records. Camp number 108, filed at RGVA Fond 1P, Opis 1E, Delo 10, describes prisoners arriving in mid-February 1943 without boots, in temperatures that dropped below -32 degrees Fahrenheit on the southern steppe. Typhus moved through the population immediately. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated the return of the surviving prisoners in the mid-1950s. The men who came home were, by then, the exception by a ratio of roughly 18-1. Every man who joined the march east in February 1943 understood that arithmetic, which is why some didn't join it. Soviet security force tallies from February and March 1943 account for 2,418 German soldiers killed in post-surrender clearance operations and 8,646 more captured and transferred to NKVD prison camps. Add those figures, 11,064. Secondary historians, rounding that number, describe approximately 11,000 Germans who refused to surrender when Strecker's capitulation was announced. The two quantities, the holdouts and the tally, appear to cross-check each other. They don't. The 11,000 estimate is derived from the same Soviet reporting tradition that produced the killed and captured columns. Both numbers came from the same bureaucratic system. The 11,000 wasn't an independent measurement against which the tally could be verified. It's the tally, rounded. This does not mean there were no holdouts. There clearly were. It means the arithmetic can't serve as its own proof, and it means the gap inside those figures requires more careful attention than the clean sum suggests. The men who remained in Stalingrad after the 2nd February 1943 didn't retreat. They had no position to retreat to. The nearest German-held territory was roughly 300 to 400 kilometers away. Manstein's Army Group Don redesignated Army Group South on the 12th February, holding a line broadly along the Donets River and the Rostov area to the southwest. Some of those who stayed chose to die in the ruins rather than go east. Others intended to hold out until a relief effort that was never coming. A smaller number had a different objective: to cover several hundred kilometers of open steppe through the rear area of a victorious army, reach German lines, and go home. This isn't retreat in any operational sense. It's something closer to an administrative disappearance. Men trying to remove themselves from a situation in which every outcome on the ledger appeared fatal. Strecker's 11th Corps held the northern pocket, the tractor factory district and the industrial neighbourhoods stretching northwest of the city centre. His divisions in the final perimeter were regular Wehrmacht infantry divisions, along with compressed remnants of other formations. The Corps order of battle contained no Waffen-SS units. This matters, and the record returns to it shortly. Strecker had been promoted to General Oberst on the 31st January 1943. The day after, Paulus was elevated to Field Marshal on the 30th January, both promotions issued by Hitler as pressure not to capitulate. Paulus surrendered anyway. Strecker held 48 more hours. His men had fought over every metre of the northern pocket since September 1942. They knew the drainage channels, accessible basements, and sewer access points, the way soldiers know ground they have nearly died on repeatedly. When the surrender announcement came on the 2nd of February, the men who didn't form the column eastward already knew where they could go. The city into which they disappeared was barely a city in any physical sense. German Luftwaffe bombing in August 1942 had obliterated much of Stalingrad's housing stock, killing tens of thousands of civilians before the ground battle even reached the city centre. 5 months of subsequent artillery and street fighting had finished whatever remained. The Stalingrad of February 1943 was a landscape of broken concrete, collapsed floors, and partially open basements extending across several kilometers of the Volga's western bank. A destroyed environment that offered almost no warmth and almost unlimited concealment. Soviet accounts of post-surrender clearance operations, published in the document collection Stalingradskaya Epopeya, materially NKVD SSSR I Wojennej Cenzury iz Centralnego Archiva FSB RF, describe teams working through this rubble systematically, checking basements room by room. Jochen Helbeck's Stalingrad, the city that defeated the Third Reich, which drew on Soviet interview transcripts gathered by historian Isaac Mintz's commission in early February 1943, records members of the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade finding small groups of Wehrmacht officers in ruined buildings alongside organized food stockpiles. Canned goods, Wehrmacht ration tins, whatever had been hoarded before the airlift finally failed in January. These weren't men surprised by the surrender announcement. They had anticipated it and prepared for what came after. The sewer network had been a combat environment since late September 1942. By that point in the battle, the fighting had moved underground. Soviet and German soldiers had used the same tunnels simultaneously, with the front running through infrastructure rather than across open ground. Men who had spent months navigating those passages knew them without maps. They also knew which sections connected to which surface points and how to move through them without emerging into visibility. Water came from the Volga, accessible from the riverbank before dawn, and from wells surviving in the rubble. Food came from abandoned German supply caches, from Soviet stores not yet cleared, and from the surrounding villages, which men with the nerve for it could approach under cover of darkness. Night movement was the structural advantage. Soviet clearance operations ran primarily during daylight, when systematic grid searches were possible. A man who stayed concealed through the day and moved only before dawn was working with the rhythms of the operation hunting him. Temperature was the absolute constraint. A U.S. Army historical study of climate on the Eastern Front, compiled from Russian meteorological records, documents January temperatures on the southern steppe at -32 degrees Fahrenheit, -36 Celsius, as the recorded low for this period. February was similar. Exposure in open ground at those temperatures produced death within hours. A man in a deep cellar, even a partially collapsed one, was cold but not necessarily dying. The ruins provided cover that the steppe categorically couldn't. A man intending to survive long enough to attempt to walk west needed the city to work in his favour. For several weeks, it did. The security force assigned primary responsibility for clearing Stalingrad wasn't, as the story is usually told, the 10th NKVD division, at least not for most of the period in question. The 10th NKVD Rifle Division was formed in Stalingrad on the 1st of February 1942 under GKO Decree No. 1092SS and NKVD Order No. 0021. Colonel Alexander Sarayev commanded it. Its founding mandate was explicit: garrison duty, public order, rear security, identification of enemy agents, and, in the direct language of the decree, liquidating airborne landings, sabotage reconnaissance groups of the enemy, and bandit formations. An internal troops formation, not a frontline rifle division. By August 1942, the German advance had overtaken that distinction, and the 10th NKVD was fighting as emergency infantry under the operational control of the 62nd Army. Of its roughly 10,000 men at the start of the urban fighting, the division suffered over 95% casualties before its remnants withdrew across the Volga in October 1942. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet awarded it the Order of Lenin on the 2nd of December 1942 and the honorary title Stalingrad. On the 5th of February 1943, 3 days after Strecker surrendered, the 10th NKVD Division was transferred to the Red Army and redesignated the 181st Stalingrad Order of Lenin Rifle Division. The unit that had defended the city ceased to exist under its original designation at the very beginning of the post-surrender period. The clearance operations that generated most of the documented figures were conducted primarily by a different formation: the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade, an NKVD motorized rifle unit, operating alongside security organs of Stalingrad Oblast under Major of State Security A.I. Voronin. Between 2nd and 8th of February, NKVD operational groups, together with military units, carried out systematic raids, basement checks, and what their reports call combing of ravines and gullies throughout the city. V.N. Merkulov, Deputy People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, documented the scope of these operations in a memorandum to Stalin dated 18th March 1943, filed at APRF, Fond 3, Opis 58, Delo 207. The Don Front Operational Report of 5th February 1943, issued at 2200, is worth reading precisely. In the operational area of the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade, Soviet troops found 18 armed SS men in a basement. The men refused to surrender. All 18 were killed. Modern scholars annotate that identification with the notation "No Waffen-SS combat divisions served inside the encircled 6th Army at Stalingrad." Strecker's 11th Corps comprised regular Wehrmacht infantry. Soviet forces applied the SS label habitually to any enemy soldier they perceived as ideologically determined or unusually resistant. What the 5th February report actually records is 18 Wehrmacht soldiers, 3 days after the official end of the battle, discovered armed in a basement and unwilling to capitulate. The label tells us about Soviet military perception of what kind of fighter would still be in that basement on that date. It reflects nothing about unit designation. The last documented armed contact appears in NKVD operational records, dated 5th March 1943. A gunfight with German soldiers in Stalingrad, more than a month after Strecker signed his surrender document. Between those two dates, the clearance operations ran through February and into early March, generating their tallies and producing the security reports that now constitute most of what the historical record contains about this period. The men the NKVD was specifically writing about, not the ones waiting in cellars to die or be found, but the ones attempting to move west, appear in Voronin's security reports throughout this period. His 20th February 1943 report on the situation in liberated Stalingrad districts, subsequent reports through the spring, and his detailed April 1st report to Beria, filed at TSA FSB Fond 3, Opis 10, Delo 136, describe German officers and soldiers attempting to cross Soviet-held territory toward German lines. The language is bureaucratic and specific. These men were engaged in robberies and attacks on villages, acquiring food, moving at night, obtaining civilian or military clothing from the surrounding population to make themselves harder to identify. The phrasing that recurs across multiple NKVD security summaries from the February-April period is consistent. Men who had changed clothes so that it is more convenient to hide. This is Soviet administrative language describing an active interdiction problem. The NKVD writing about men it was trying to stop, not about men it had already stopped. The route those men would have needed to follow is reconstructible from the operational geography of early 1943. Westward from the ruins of Stalingrad, through the immediate city outskirts, where security was densest in the weeks after surrender. The Don River, frozen in February and crossable on foot in theory, but observable at every practical crossing. Beyond the Don, the open steppe of the southern Kalmyk region, flat ground with winter visibility extending for kilometers, no natural cover except scattered settlements and erosion gullies. The Sal River, then the Manich River system, each crossing a watched choke point with no concealment on the approach. Then the Donets River line, where Manstein's forces were operating during the counter-offensive that temporarily retook Kharkov on 14th March 1943. From the ruins of Stalingrad to those positions, roughly 300 to 400 kilometers. The 300-kilometer estimate assumes a direct southwest route and the most favorable sector. Actual distance varied as the front shifted and was never less than that. During Manstein's February-March counteroffensive, German forces were advancing northeast toward Kharkov, not toward Stalingrad. The nearest German positions in the Stalingrad direction remained several hundred kilometers away throughout February and March. A man walking west from the ruins wasn't walking toward an advancing German line. He was walking through the rear of the Soviet army that had just processed nearly 100,000 prisoners in 6 weeks. Supply routes, transit points, NKVD security checkpoints at major road junctions and river crossings, village Soviets instructed to report strangers, and the general heightened alertness of a military administration still conducting active clearance operations across the same territory. For a German soldier with no Russian, no documents, and no cover story, the steppe was a surveillance environment where the primary hazard was visibility itself. In the ruins, rubble was concealment. On open ground, a man on foot was observable for kilometers in any direction. One participant account, collected in the post-war volume Survivors of Stalingrad, edited by Reinhold Busch, captures this assessment without decoration. Hundreds of kilometers of snow-covered steppe, hardly any chance of hiding oneself. That came from men who had survived the encirclement and were evaluating the terrain with full knowledge of what lay between them and German lines. Before the figures are drawn, the question of who exactly they are counting requires a direct answer, because the commenter who will raise this is right to raise it. Approximately 50,000 Hilfswillige, Hiwis, Soviet citizens who had served in various auxiliary capacities with the German 6th Army were in the Stalingrad pocket at the time of encirclement. For a Soviet citizen found to have served the German military, capture didn't mean prisoner of war status. It meant accusation of treason, with outcomes ranging from summary execution to long gulag sentences. The Journal of Slavic Military Studies academic study, Escape from Stalingrad, Soviet Nationals with the German Sixth Army, traces the experiences of Ukrainians and Russians trapped in the pocket through spring and summer 1943, documenting that Hiwis facing Soviet capture had every reason to attempt evasion. Whether the 91,000 prisoner figure, and by extension any holdout estimate derived from it, includes Hiwis or processes them under separate Soviet administrative categories, isn't uniformly resolved across the sources. Soviet operational reporting focused primarily on German soldiers and officers as a distinct administrative category. Hiwi capture and processing generated different paperwork, routed through different security organs. This ambiguity is genuine and can't be resolved by the available published record. The killed and captured columns, whatever they contain, don't come with a demographic breakdown that isolates German nationals from Soviet collaborators. Among those formally captured and sent to camps, a separate escape vector operated alongside the men who had never joined the column in the first place. The NKVD maintained strict numerical accountability for prisoner populations. Under NKVD Order No. 00398 of 1 March 1943, with archival references at RGVA Fond 9401, Opis 1, Delo 637, and RGVA Fond 1P, Opis 5E, Delo 2, the NKVD directed the removal of 78,500 prisoners from the Stalingrad area to camps farther from the front. That administrative order reflects how concentrated the prisoner population had become within 6 weeks of the surrender. Camp escapes in this environment were operationally difficult, but not impossible. A man who survived the transit, recovered some strength, and had any knowledge of the terrain retained options, however narrow. Escapees from formal camps would have generated administrative records, escape reports, search orders, recapture reports. Those records exist in UPVI files at RGVA. They haven't been published in any synthesis covering the Stalingrad area specifically in February and March 1943. The volume Vojenoplenje ver SSR, Volume 2, Vojenoplenje ver Stalingrad, compiled in Volgograd in 2003 with complete Fond Opis Delo citations for the NKVD orders of this period, covers camp administration and prisoner processing in detail. It does not address the escape accounting for individual camps during this specific window. The legal position of a German soldier caught in civilian clothes behind Soviet lines in early 1943 was specific and not favourable. The Hague Regulations of 1907 and the 1929 Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, the two instruments of international law applicable in this period, held that combatants qualified for POW protections only if they wore a fixed distinctive sign, carried arms openly, and obeyed the laws of war. Combatants operating in civilian dress while conducting or supporting military activity behind enemy lines were classified as spies or unlawful combatants, subject to trial and execution rather than prisoner processing. The Soviet Union had not ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention. In practice, Soviet counterintelligence and NKVD security organs treated Germans operating behind lines in civilian clothes or Soviet military uniforms as a distinct category from uniformed prisoners. The language of Voronin's reports frames them explicitly as a security threat, not as soldiers with prisoner status. Armed men found in civilian dress after a combat incident were typically processed as bandits under Soviet military law, with a high probability of tribunal execution following interrogation. Men caught in civilian clothes who could be positively identified as German soldiers might be processed into the formal POW system, but flagged for extended interrogation under NKVD security organ control rather than the relative, if limited, structure of a numbered camp. The decision any man in that situation had to make wasn't between safety and danger. Both paths were dangerous. Staying in uniform meant immediate identification as a German soldier, with a survival rate, based on available evidence, of roughly 1 in 18 over the following 12 years. Changing into civilian clothes offered the possibility of passing through Soviet territory without immediate identification, right up until someone checked documents, registered a language failure, or reported a stranger at the well. If caught in civilian clothes, the classification shifted from prisoner to suspected spy. Both outcomes arrived at the same destination. The only meaningful difference was the terrain you could cross before one of them caught you. Part of the NKVD's Stalingrad period documentation has been declassified and published in Russia since 2000, and the honest version of what remains unknown depends on understanding what is actually accessible. The document collection Stalingradskaya Epopeya, Materiali NKVD SSSR I Wojennej Cenzury iz Centralnego Archiva FSB RF, published in 2000, contains selected operational and censorship materials from the FSB's Central Archive. Volume 4, Book 1 of Organy Gosudarstwennej Bezopasnosti SSSR w Wielkiej Oteczestwennej Wojnie includes a March 1943 NKVD note to the GKO on German agents in liberated cities, a certificate from UNKVD Stalingrad Oblast dated 19 March 1943 covering the department's February operational work, and NKVD Directive No. 136 from the same date. Voronin's April 1, 1943 report to Beria is catalogued at TSA FSB Fond 3, Opis 10, Delo 136, folios 45 through 63, and accessible through the Presidential Library's archival catalogue. Merkulov's 18th March memo to Stalin at APRF Fond 3, Opis 58, Delo 207, has been published through the Yakovlev Foundation. Merkulov's breakdown for Stalingrad Oblast, specifically by 10th March, 479 suspected agents, 1,423 collaborators, 78 bandits and deserters, 470 categorized as other anti-Soviet elements, 2,450 total arrests of all types, a different administrative category from the brigade's German soldier count. This is selective declassification, curated releases from specific collections, some fully accessible through the Archivi Rossii portal, some requiring formal application to the FSB Central Archive, some accessible only with institutional clearance to RGVA. Anthony Beever's Stalingrad, published in 1998 and drawing on Russian archive material, including daily Tsar Mo reports from Podolsk, covers the post-surrender period primarily through prisoner processing and Soviet political management of the victory. Beaver had access to the Podolsk archives and used them extensively. The book's treatment of the battle itself is built on that material. The subject of holdouts attempting to move west receives no systematic treatment. Sidorov's 2023 article in Vestnik Volgogradskiego Uniwersytetu, drawing directly on RGVA and Tsar Mo materials, focuses on POW camp administration in the Stalingrad area. The closest any published academic work in either language comes to the specific operational question, and still at a significant distance from it. What hasn't appeared in any published collection is the file that would tell us about the men moving west in specific individual level terms. Operational logs tracking groups by location, date, intercept point, and outcome. The 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade's primary report, the the document directly behind the 2,418 and 8,646 figures, has been cited in the secondary literature without its Fond Opis Delo coordinates appearing in the published record. Scholars who have worked in RGVA and SAMO on this period have used such records in their research without publishing the complete file signatures. The picture is partial access, not blanket closure, and not blanket openness. The specific file that would account for the men in acquired civilian coats moving southwest at night hasn't appeared in any published collection in either language. The figures that survive the clearance operations carry several layers of uncertainty that the clean arithmetic obscures. The 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade's 2,418 killed and 8,646 captured represent one formation's accounting, not a comprehensive NKVD closing tally for the entire operational area. The brigade was the primary clearance unit, but it operated alongside other formations, keeping separate records. An NKVD border troops unit operating in overlapping territory documented 138 killed and 181 captured, in what appears to be a parallel accounting from a different administrative chain. Whether those men are distinct individuals or the same men counted under two reporting systems isn't established in any published source. The 11,064 may undercount the actual toll. It may contain duplicated entries. The primary document that would resolve this, the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade's own operational report with its complete administrative coordinates, hasn't been found in any published collection with a verifiable Fond Opis Delo citation. Merkulov's 18th March memo to Stalin reports 2,450 arrests in Stalingrad Oblast by 10th March, broken down by category. That is a different count covering a different population. Soviet citizens accused of collaboration, not German military personnel exclusively, and can't be directly compared to the brigade's killed and captured columns. What the 11,064 can't account for is the category that occupies neither column. Men who died of exposure without combat contact and without generating a clearance report. Men killed in incidents that went unfiled by the responsible unit. And most directly, the men Voronin's department specifically documented as a distinct security problem. Officers and soldiers in acquired civilian clothing, documented as moving westward through Soviet territory, documented as the explicit target of active interdiction, and not documented as appearing in any accounting that can be distinguished from the general tally of killed and captured. Across the full body of accessible published scholarship, Beaver's Stalingrad, Glantz's Stalingrad Trilogy, Reinhold Busch's Survivors of Stalingrad, specialist academic journals in English, German, Russian and Polish, no securely documented case has been established of a German soldier leaving the Stalingrad ruins after Sect February 1943 and reaching German-held territory on foot. One disputed account circulates in specialist discussions of the period. A lone sergeant reportedly reaching the 6th Panzer Division before dying to a mortar round, sourced in secondary recollection without any verifiable archival reference. It can't be confirmed. The Army Group Don War Diary, covering operations through 12th February 1943, when the formation was redesignated Army Group South under Manstein, is held at Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg under collection RH 196. Subsequent Army Group South records for February and March 1943 exist in the same archive, with diary excerpts for 16th through 28th February and 1st through 23rd March documented in the Deutsche Digitale Bibliothek Finding Aid. The Bundesarchiv holds more than 50 kilometers of files from the German armed forces. The Deutsche Dienststelle, the military search service that processed German casualty and missing records for decades after 1945. Scholars have used these records. None has published a case of a Stalingrad-listed soldier reappearing in German records as a received straggler from the East after February 1943. The German archive, as much as has been consulted, confirms the silence in the Soviet one, as much as has been published. The NKVD counted 2,418 Germans killed after the surrender and 8,646 taken prisoner up to March 1943. The sum is 11,064, almost exactly the number reconstructed as having refused to march east on February. The paperwork closes neatly. It closes far too neatly because both columns come from the same reporting system and were never an independent check against each other, and because those two columns account for every man as either killed or captured, leaving no space for the ones the security reports were actually written about. The officers and soldiers in stolen coats, documented as moving west at night, robbing villages to eat, changing clothes so that it was more convenient to hide. Somewhere between those figures is a group of men who walked out of the largest battle ever fought and simply stopped appearing in anyone's records. On 5th of March 1943, more than a month after Karl Strecker signed his capitulation document, NKVD security forces recorded a gunfight with German soldiers in Stalingrad. That is the last entry. After it, 11,064, and the arithmetic that closes, and the gap the arithmetic can't close, and the files that would resolve the difference, still in Russian archives, published only in part. We don't know how many. We don't know if a single one of them made it.